London, 1888. The capital of the British Empire stands at the height of its power. Queen Victoria reigns over a quarter of the world's population. The city gleams with gaslight and prosperity, a beacon of civilization and progress. But beneath this veneer of Victorian grandeur lies a darker reality, one of poverty, desperation, and unspeakable horror. In the East End district of Whitechapel, where the fog rolls thick through narrow alleyways and the poor huddle in overcrowded tenements, a shadow is about to fall. A shadow that will grip the city in terror and create a legend that endures to this day. This is the documentary story of Jack the Ripper, the world's most infamous serial killer, whose identity remains a mystery more than a century after his crimes. A story of brutal murders, a society divided, and a case that changed criminal investigation forever. To understand the Ripper, we must first understand Whitechapel. In 1888, this district was one of the most impoverished areas in London, a place where hope came to die. The Industrial Revolution had drawn thousands to London seeking work, but not all found fortune. Instead, many descended into a hellish existence in the East End. Whitechapel was a maze of narrow streets and dark alleyways, where as many as 8 people might share a single room. Sanitation was primitive. Disease was rampant. The air reeked of human waste, rotting garbage, and the acrid smoke from countless chimneys. For women in Whitechapel, options were severely limited. Domestic service, factory work, or prostitution, these were often the only choices. And when poverty became desperate enough, many turned to the streets. Contemporary police estimates suggested that around 1,200 prostitutes worked in Whitechapel alone, though the actual number was likely much higher. These women faced constant danger. Violence, disease, alcoholism, and the crushing weight of poverty made their lives precarious. Yet even in this harsh environment, nothing could have prepared them for what was coming. The summer of 1888 was unseasonably warm, but as autumn approached, a chill settled over Whitechapel that had nothing to do with the weather. Something evil had awakened in the shadows. While several murders occurred in Whitechapel during this period, 5 victims are generally accepted as the canonical murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. These women, their lives marked by hardship and their deaths by unspeakable brutality, would become forever linked in history. August 31st, 1888. At approximately 3:40 in the morning, Charles Cross, a carman on his way to work, discovered the body of a woman lying in Bucks Row, a narrow street in Whitechapel. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to those who knew her. She was 43 years old, though poverty and alcohol had aged her beyond her years. Born Mary Ann Walker, she had married William Nichols and borne 5 children. But alcohol destroyed the marriage, and by 1880, she was living apart from her family. In the years that followed, Polly moved between workhouses, occasional domestic positions, and the streets. On the night of her death, she had been turned away from a lodging house for lacking the 4 pence required for a bed. Her last known words were spoken to a friend: "I'll soon get my doss money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." That bonnet would be found beside her body just hours later. The wounds inflicted upon Mary Ann Nichols were shocking. Her throat had been cut twice, with such force that the blade had penetrated to the vertebrae. Her abdomen had been slashed multiple times. The brutality suggested rage, but the precision suggested knowledge, perhaps medical knowledge. Dr. Rees Ralph Llewellyn, who examined the body at the scene, noted that there was relatively little blood, suggesting the abdominal mutilations had been performed after death. The killer had worked quickly and disturbingly, with some degree of anatomical understanding. News of the murder spread quickly through Whitechapel, but similar killings had occurred before. Many assumed this was simply another tragic incident in a district where violence was commonplace. They had no idea that this was just the beginning. September 8, 1888. Just over a week after Mary Ann Nichols's murder, another body was discovered. This time, the location was the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street. Annie Chapman, 47 years old, had led a life of struggle similar to Polly Nichols. Born Eliza Ann Smith in 1841, she married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869. They had 3 children, but 2 died young. The marriage deteriorated, worsened by Annie's drinking, and by 1882 they had separated. Annie attempted to support herself through crochet work and selling flowers, but poverty drove her to prostitution. She suffered from chronic illness, tuberculosis and a brain disease, and friends reported that she had been unwell in the days before her death. On the night of September 7th, she was seen leaving a lodging house, turned away because she lacked the 8 pence for a bed. At approximately 6 in the morning, resident John Davis went into the backyard and discovered Annie's body. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The killer had escalated. Annie's throat had been cut with such violence that her head was nearly severed from her body. But the abdominal mutilations were far more extensive than those inflicted on Mary and Nichols. Her intestines had been removed and placed on her shoulder. Her uterus and part of her bladder had been taken away. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon, conducted the post-mortem examination. His findings were chilling. The killer had demonstrated anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. The uterus had been removed with precision, not the haphazard slashing of a madman, but the deliberate work of someone who knew what they were doing. More disturbing still was the time frame. Based on witness testimony and medical evidence, the killer had performed these extensive mutilations in less than 30 minutes, possibly as little as 15 minutes, in a backyard that was accessible from multiple directions. The audacity was breathtaking. The skill was undeniable. Panic began to grip Whitechapel. 2 women, both poor prostitutes, had been killed and mutilated in similar fashion. A pattern was emerging, and the East End realized with growing horror that a monster walked among them. On September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter that would forever change the case and create the legend we know today. Written in red ink, the letter was addressed "Dear Boss," and taunted the police about the murders. The author claimed to be the killer and promised to continue his work. He threatened to clip the ladies' ears off and send them to the police. And he signed the letter with a name that would echo through history: Jack the Ripper. The letter's authenticity has been debated for over a century. Many believe it was a hoax, written by a journalist seeking to sensationalize the case. But true or not, the name stuck. The killer now had an identity, a persona that newspapers could trumpet and the public could fear. Jack the Ripper had been born September 30th, 1888. In the early hours of the morning, Jack the Ripper would commit not one murder, but 2, forever cementing his place in criminal history as one of the most audacious killers of all time. Elizabeth Stride was 44 years old, born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden in 1843. She had emigrated to London in the 1860s and married John Stride in 1869. They ran a coffee shop together, but the business failed and the marriage ended. By the 1880s, Elizabeth was living in common-law relationships and supporting herself through sewing and prostitution. Those who knew her described her as quiet and careful. She rarely drank to excess, unlike many in her circumstances. But on the night of September 29th, she was seen in the company of various men, moving through the streets of Whitechapel. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, Louis Deemschutz, a jewelry salesman, was driving his pony cart into Dutfield's yard off Burner Street when his horse shied. Using his whip to investigate the obstruction, he discovered Elizabeth Stride's body lying against the wall. Her throat had been cut, the slash so deep it nearly severed her carotid artery. She bled to death within minutes. But unlike the previous victims, there were no abdominal mutilations. The killer's work had been interrupted. It's believed that Deemschutz's arrival startled the Ripper, forcing him to flee before he could complete his grisly work. But the night was still young, and the Ripper's bloodlust had not been satisfied. Less than an hour later and less than a mile away, the Ripper would strike again, this time with a fury that suggested rage at being interrupted. Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old, was born in Wolverhampton in 1842. She had lived with Thomas Conway for over 20 years and borne him 3 children, but they separated in the early 1880s. By 1888, she was living with John Kelly in the common lodging houses of the East End. On the night of September 29th, Catherine had been arrested for drunkenness and placed in a police cell to sober up. She was released at 1 o'clock in the morning, precisely when Elizabeth Stride was being murdered. Catherine walked out of the police station and directly into history's darkest pages. At approximately 1:45, Police Constable Edward Watkins discovered her body in Mitre Square. What the Ripper had done in those few minutes was almost incomprehensible. Catherine's throat had been cut. Her face had been mutilated, with the tip of her nose and part of her earlobe cut away. Her abdomen had been opened, and her intestines had been pulled out and placed over her right shoulder. Her left kidney and most of her uterus had been removed and taken away. The precision of the cuts astounded the examining doctors. The kidney had been removed with skill, cutting through the renal artery with barely any damage to surrounding tissue. This was not the work of a butcher or a layman, this was someone with anatomical knowledge. But the Ripper had also left something behind. A piece of Catherine's bloodied apron had been cut away and was later found on Golston Street, about a third of a mile from Mitre Square. Above it, written in chalk on a wall, was a message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of this message, the Golston Street graffito, has been debated ever since. Was it written by the Ripper? Was it a cryptic clue, or meaningless gibberish? Was the misspelling deliberate or ignorant? We may never know, because Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, ordered the writing erased before it could be photographed, fearing it might incite anti-Semitic violence in an area with a large Jewish population. The double murder, 2 women killed in the same night, sent shockwaves through London. The audacity was staggering. The killer had murdered 1 woman, been interrupted, and within the hour had found and killed another victim, performing extensive mutilations in a public square between police patrols. The message was clear: Jack the Ripper could strike anywhere, anytime, and no one could stop him. On October 1st, another letter arrived, this time addressed to George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside the package was half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits. The letter, written in a crude hand, claimed the kidney belonged to Catherine Eddowes, and that the writer had fried and ate the other half. "From hell, Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from 1 woman, preserved it for you." Was this really from the killer? Medical examination was inconclusive. The kidney could have been Catherine's, or it could have been a macabre hoax using a medical specimen. But the possibility that the killer had indeed sent part of his victim to the police was deeply disturbing. November 9, 1888. The final canonical victim. The youngest. And the most brutally murdered of them all. Mary Jane Kelly was only 25 years old, significantly younger than the previous victims. Born in Limerick, Ireland, around 1863, she claimed to have been married briefly to a collier who died in a mining accident. She moved to London in the early 1880s and worked as a prostitute. Unlike the other victims, Mary rented a small room at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street. It wasn't much, a single room about 12 feet square, but it was hers. On the evening of November 8th, she was seen returning to her room with a man, singing and apparently in good spirits despite owing rent. At 10:45 the next morning, Thomas Bowyer, sent by the landlord to collect the overdue rent, knocked on Mary's door. Receiving no answer, he looked through a broken window pane. What he saw made him stagger back in horror. Mary Jane Kelly's murder was different from all the others. This time, the Ripper had privacy. This time, he had hours. And this time, he revealed the full extent of his depravity. The scene inside that tiny room was one of almost unimaginable horror. Mary's body had been virtually destroyed. Her throat had been cut down to the spine. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her abdomen had been opened and her internal organs systematically removed. Her heart was missing, taken away by the killer. The walls were splattered with blood. Pieces of flesh had been arranged around the room. The Ripper had spent hours with his victim, performing mutilations that went far beyond anything seen in the previous murders. Dr. Thomas Bond, who performed the post-mortem examination, was deeply disturbed by what he witnessed. In his report to Scotland Yard, he concluded that the killer demonstrated no surgical skill. The mutilations were too extensive and destructive to show precision. This contradicted the observations of other doctors, but Bond's psychological insights were more valuable. He concluded that the killer was a man of solitary habits, possibly eccentric, and suffering from what we would now recognize as a severe psychiatric disorder. After Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the canonical killings stopped. There were other murders in Whitechapel in subsequent years, some attributed by contemporary police to the Ripper, but none with the same distinct signature. Jack the Ripper, it seemed, had either died, been incarcerated for another crime, or simply stopped killing. The police investigation into the Ripper murders was unprecedented in scope but ultimately frustrated at every turn. The Metropolitan Police, led by Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, and the City of London Police, overseeing the area where Catherine Eddowes was killed, both threw massive resources at the case. Hundreds of men were interviewed. Door-to-door inquiries were conducted throughout Whitechapel. Plainclothes officers patrolled the streets. Detectives were brought in from across the country. Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline, an experienced detective with years of East End experience, led much of the investigation. Detective Inspectors Henry Moore, Walter Andrews, and Edmund Reed all played crucial roles. These were skilled, dedicated officers doing their best with the tools available to them. But those tools were severely limited by the standards of modern forensic science. In 1888, there was no fingerprint analysis. The technique wouldn't be adopted by British police for another 13 years. There was no DNA testing, no blood typing, no surveillance cameras, no computerized databases. What the police did have was witness testimony, and there was no shortage of that. Dozens of people claimed to have seen the victims in their final hours, often in the company of men. But the descriptions varied wildly, and the reliability of witnesses in Whitechapel, many of whom were drunk, impoverished, or both, was questionable. Some described a man in his 30s, of medium height, with a dark mustache and wearing a dark coat. Others described someone younger, taller, clean-shaven, or with different clothing. The most famous sighting was by George Hutchinson, who claimed to have seen Mary Jane Kelly with a well-dressed man carrying a bag on the night of her murder. But Hutchinson's detailed description, almost suspiciously detailed, has led many to question whether he saw anything at all, or whether he might even have been involved. The investigation was hampered by other factors as well. The jurisdictional divide between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police created communication difficulties. The massive public attention and press scrutiny created pressure that sometimes led to hasty decisions. And the social conditions of Whitechapel itself, the transient population, the general distrust of police, the darkness and maze-like streets, made investigation extraordinarily difficult. Hundreds of suspects were investigated. Local butchers and slaughtermen, doctors and medical students, sailors and foreign visitors, men with mental illnesses or violent histories, all came under scrutiny. Many were questioned, some were held briefly, but none were ever charged. The police tried innovative techniques. They used bloodhounds, though the experiment was a failure. They consulted with doctors and alienists, what we would now call psychiatrists, seeking psychological profiles of the killer. They distributed leaflets asking for information. They even considered using photography and early forms of crime scene analysis. But in the end, Jack the Ripper vanished into the fog and darkness from which he had emerged. The investigation, despite its scale and intensity, ended in failure. In the century and more since the murders, literally hundreds of suspects have been proposed. Some theories are based on solid historical evidence. Others are little more than imaginative speculation. Let's examine some of the most prominent suspects and theories. Druitt was a barrister and schoolmaster whose body was found in the Thames in December 1888, just weeks after the final canonical murder. Sir Melville Macnaghten, who became Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police in 1890, named Druitt as his favored suspect in an internal memorandum. Macnaghten believed Druitt was sexually insane and that his family suspected him of being the Ripper. The timing of Druitt's suicide seemed to fit with the cessation of the murders. However, modern researchers have found significant problems with this theory. Druitt was in Dorset, over 100 miles from London, on at least one of the murder dates. The evidence against him is largely circumstantial and based on Macnaghten's personal suspicions rather than solid proof. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish barber who lived in Whitechapel and suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia. He was named by several senior police officers, including Donald Swanson, as a strong suspect. According to Swanson's private notes, Kosminski was identified by a witness, but the identification couldn't be used because the witness, a fellow Jew, refused to testify against him. Kosminski was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891, where he remained until his death in 1819. The case for Kosminski gained new attention in 2014 when author Russell Edwards claimed DNA evidence linked Kosminski to a shawl supposedly found at Catherine Eddowes's murder scene. However, this claim has been heavily criticized by experts who question the shawl's provenance, the methodology of the DNA analysis, and the conclusions drawn. Michael Ostrog. Ostrog was a Russian-born confidence trickster and petty criminal with a history of mental instability. He was named by Macnaghten as one of 3 suspects, but modern research has found little evidence to support his involvement. He appears to have been in prison in France at the time of some of the murders, effectively ruling him out. Tumblety was an Irish-American doctor and charlatan with a hatred of women and a collection of preserved uteri, a disturbing hobby that immediately makes him seem suspicious. He was arrested in London in November 1888 on charges of gross indecency and fled to the United States after posting bail. American police were asked to monitor him, and Chief Inspector John Littlechild, in a letter written years later, named Tumblety as a very likely suspect. However, Tumblety's physical description, he was tall and distinctive-looking, doesn't match most witness descriptions of men seen with the victims. James Maybrick. The theory that Liverpool cotton merchant James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper emerged with the publication of the Maybrick Diary in 1993. The diary, purportedly written by Maybrick, contains confessions to the Ripper murders. However, forensic analysis and historical research have concluded that the diary is almost certainly a modern forgery. The handwriting doesn't match Maybrick's known writing, anachronistic language appears in the text, and no credible provenance for the diary's existence before 1992 has been established. Prince Albert Victor. Perhaps the most sensational theory is that Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and grandson of Queen Victoria, was Jack the Ripper. This theory has been popular in fiction but has no credible historical basis. Royal archives show that Prince Albert Victor was in Scotland during several of the murders, and the theory relies on supposition and conspiracy rather than evidence. It persists largely because of its dramatic appeal rather than any factual foundation. The Jill the Ripper theory. Some have suggested the killer might have been a woman, a midwife or abortionist who could move through the streets without suspicion. This would explain how the killer was able to approach victims and avoid detection. However, the physical strength required for some of the attacks, combined with witness descriptions consistently describing male suspects, makes this theory unlikely. The Royal Conspiracy Theory. Popularized by the book Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution by Stephen Knight, this elaborate theory suggests the murders were orchestrated by the royal family and Freemasons to cover up a secret marriage. While making for entertaining fiction, the theory has been thoroughly debunked by serious historians. The reality is that we will almost certainly never know the true identity of Jack the Ripper. The passage of time, the destruction of documents, and the limitations of Victorian-era investigation mean that definitive proof is unlikely to ever emerge. What we can say is that the killer was probably someone who lived or worked in Whitechapel, someone who knew the area's geography intimately. He was likely male, probably aged between 25 and 45. He may have had anatomical knowledge, though opinions differ on how much skill he actually demonstrated. He was almost certainly suffering from severe psychopathology, what modern psychiatry might diagnose as psychopathy or psychosis. He was comfortable with blood and cutting, suggesting possible experience with animals or medical specimens. And he was audacious, confident, and ruthless in his crimes. Beyond that, Jack the Ripper remains a shadow, a phantom killer who emerged from the darkness, committed atrocities, and then vanished, leaving only questions behind. The Jack the Ripper case had profound effects that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of 5 murdered women. The Ripper case exposed the inadequacies of Victorian-era police methods and spurred innovations in criminal investigation. The use of criminal profiling, even in its primitive form, began with the Ripper case. Dr. Thomas Bond's attempt to analyze the psychology of the killer was one of the first psychological profiles ever created. The case also highlighted the need for better coordination between police forces and more systematic approaches to evidence collection and witness interviews. While forensic science as we know it was still decades away, the Ripper investigation represented an important step in its development. The Ripper murders drew attention to the desperate conditions in London's East End. Newspapers and reformers used the case to highlight the poverty, overcrowding, and social neglect that characterized areas like Whitechapel. While change was slow, The publicity surrounding the murders contributed to growing calls for social reform. Housing conditions, public health, and the treatment of the poor became topics of increased public discussion and political attention. The Ripper case was one of the first to receive massive media coverage. The penny press, with its sensational headlines and vivid descriptions, created a template for crime reporting that persists to this day. The name Jack the Ripper itself, possibly invented by a journalist, demonstrates the power of media in shaping public perception. The killer became a character, almost a dark celebrity, and this pattern of serial killer notoriety would repeat throughout history. In the years since, Jack the Ripper has appeared in countless books, films, television shows, and other media. He has been reimagined as everything from a supernatural entity to a symbol of Victorian hypocrisy. The case has inspired both serious historical research and wild speculation, scholarly studies and sensational fiction. For too long, the Ripper case focused on the killer rather than those he killed. The 5 canonical victims were reduced to footnotes in the story of their murderer. In recent years, there has been a movement to recenter the narrative on the women themselves: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These were real people with hopes, struggles, relationships, and lives that mattered. Their deaths exposed the vulnerability of the poorest in Victorian society, women with no safety net, no protection, forced into dangerous circumstances by poverty and lack of options. Their stories remind us that behind sensational crime narratives are real human tragedies. More than 130 years have passed since the Autumn of Terror in Whitechapel. The narrow streets where Jack the Ripper stalked his victims have been rebuilt and modernized. The slums are gone, replaced by businesses and apartments. London has changed beyond recognition. But the mystery remains. Jack the Ripper's identity is still unknown, and likely always will be. Despite advances in forensic science, despite decades of research, despite hundreds of theories and suspects, the shadow that fell over Whitechapel in 1888 has never been fully illuminated. Perhaps that is why the case continues to fascinate us. In an age where science and technology promise answers to every question, Jack the Ripper reminds us that some mysteries endure. Some shadows are too deep to penetrate. Some questions have no answers. The 5 women who died in those autumn months, Mary and Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as people whose lives mattered. They lived in difficult circumstances, struggled to survive, and met brutal ends. Their stories are part of history, part of the narrative of Victorian London and the long struggle for social justice and human dignity. As for Jack the Ripper, he remains what he always was, a phantom, a shadow, a symbol of humanity's capacity for inexplicable evil. His crimes shocked the world, changed criminal investigation, and created a legend that has outlived everyone who lived through that terrible autumn. The fog has long since lifted from Whitechapel streets. The gas lamps have been replaced by electric lights. But the mystery of Jack the Ripper endures, a reminder that even in our modern world, with all its knowledge and technology, some darkness remains impenetrable. This is the story of Jack the Ripper, 5 women murdered, a city gripped by terror, an investigation that failed, and a mystery that will never be solved. It is a story of its time and yet timeless, horrifying and yet endlessly fascinating. The legend of Jack the Ripper will continue as long as people wonder about the nature of evil, the limits of justice, and the shadows that lurk in the human heart. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and share for more amazing documentary videos.